Well, we knew it was coming, and today the Reserve Bank all but confirmed interest rates are about to go up. The RBA has released minutes from its June board meeting, saying members acknowledge that if inflation expectations were to rise materially from current levels, it could require significantly higher interest rates to bring inflation back to target, with adverse implications for growth in output and employment. And as we know, in the year to May, inflation rose 4%, exceeding expectations, despite, of course, Labor constantly reassuring us that they've got it under control. To unpack all this, we're joined by macro business chief economist Leith Van Onselen. Leith, good to see you. It's more grim news on the way for homeowners by the sounds.
Yeah, it is. Look, it's grim news for homeowners in that rates are going to remain higher for longer. I think we can all agree on that. That said, Danica, I don't believe it's a slam dunk that the Reserve Bank's going to hike rates necessarily again. So while last week's May CPI indicator was obviously not good news and it was a shocker, the Reserve Bank minutes that were released today also noted that they are concerned that the labour market's weakening quicker than they expected. And given the RBA has a dual mandate of both price stability and full employment, its concerns around the labour market, will reduce the likelihood of rate hikes. So I think before the RBA makes its call on interest rates, it'll look at this month's June labour force release to see how strong that is, the retail sales, and the all-important Q2 quarterly CPI print, which is the most comprehensive. And it'll draw an assessment based on that. And if obviously the Q2 inflation comes in stronger than they'd like, and the unemployment rate falls, for example, then I think we'll get rate hikes. But we'll have to wait to see how the data, how the cards fall with the data.
What about in terms of stimulus measures? The governments across the board, they're adding cost of living measures on top of the tax cuts that came into force yesterday. Is that making it worse?
Yeah, look, the cost of living measures will actually temporarily lower CPI, but they're making the situation worse in that they're an expensive Band-Aid that's been paid for by you and I, i.e. the taxpayers, and they don't fix the underlying causes. So both rents and energy inflation are tracking well above the Reserve Bank's 2 to 3% inflation target despite the subsidies. And, basically these two things have been driven by poor policy. So, for example, on the rental side, we've got obviously the Albanese government's big migration is driving rents through the roof. And then also we've got all the energy policy failures. So, I suppose, the subsidies do help in the short term, but they're not fixing the underlying problems and the cause of the inflation in the first place. Also, the stage 3 tax cuts, obviously, they're going to add to inflation pressure, giving households more money. That being said, I think they're actually good policy because I'm a firm believer that income tax scales should be indexed to inflation anyway, and the stage 3 tax cuts is a temporary version of that.
Now, I want to talk to you about housing linked to migration. You have been following the migration patterns in this country for some time now. And we've got some industry analysis finding that one new home would have to be built every 2 minutes to cater for the rapidly growing population and the surge in the migration intake. Leith, look, this is an astonishing report, but are you surprised at all?
Look, I'm not surprised at all. Look, I'll be quite frank. Australia has zero chance of meeting the Albanese government's target to build 1.2 million homes or 200 over 5 years or 240,000 homes a year. Look, the highest number of homes that Australia has ever built in a single 12-month period was 223,500 in 2017. And back then we had much lower interest rates. We had much lower materials costs. Materials hadn't increased 40% like they have over the pandemic. And builders weren't competing with state governments for workers with their massive infrastructure projects. So, look, the number one solution to Australia's housing crisis is for the federal government to cut immigration sharply to a level that is below the nation's capacity to build housing and infrastructure. And if they don't do that, the housing crisis is going to keep getting worse. The shortages are going to get worse. More people are going to be thrown into homelessness and group housing. It's as simple as that.
Absolutely. I've been saying for a long time this is now an acute vote-driving issue that both parties obviously have plans at the next election, but it is a very important one in the cost of living crisis. Before we let you go, power prices are expected to rise again as big coal power stations are shut down and the rollout of renewable and storage capacity slows. I mean, we've been talking about our renewables rollout is happening back to front in this country. Leith, is this further evidence of the real costs of rolling out renewables?
Yeah, look, I think the bigger issue, Australia's energy transition's broken because we've engineered an artificial gas shortage on the East Coast and we've delivered some of the highest gas prices in the world. And without gas, you can't have cheap energy because gas is the peaking fuel that's used to generate electricity. So whenever the wind isn't blowing and we don't have enough solar, we need gas as the backstop. And if you have expensive gas, you have expensive electricity. So the solution to Australia's energy crisis is for the federal government to copy every other gas exporting jurisdiction in the world, including Western Australia, and to reserve gas for domestic use, for our use first before we export it, and to make that gas abundant and relatively cheap. And if we do that, we'll also have cheap electricity prices and we'll fix the energy crisis. That's the number one solution.
Yeah, absolutely. Fair point. Leith Van Onselen, thank you so much for your insights as always.